Good afternoon, Professor Diane Coyle. Good afternoon. Hi, Nitin.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Just waiting for some more guests who had shown interest and who are working on this issue in India to join this conversation, and then we'll formally begin the proceedings. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll just go.
So, good afternoon. Good afternoon from a very sunny winter day in Delhi, and very, very warm welcome to Professor Diane Coyle for the second in a series of webinars on artificial intelligence, markets, and competition. She speaks today on generative AI and competition policy. This webinar is organized under the aegis of ICRIER Prosus Centre for Internet and Digital Economy that has recently released a report, and we may be sharing it in the chat, on AI markets and competition in India. We are very privileged to have Professor Dame Diane Coyle, who is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. Her latest book is Cogs and Monsters, What Economics Is and What It Should Be, that explores the challenges for economics, particularly in the context of digital transformation. So we are privileged to have her as an economist. Diane is also a director of the Productivity Institute, a fellow of the Office for National Statistics, very accomplished person, and her CV is, in the sense I was very, very impressed, and I could go on. And she's an expert advisor to the National Infrastructure Commission. She has served in several public service roles, and she was awarded a DBE for her contribution to economic policy in 2023, the King's Birthday Honors. Just to give a brief context to the talk and why we were interested in getting international scholars to speak, because issues are quite similar. Companies traverse global boundaries. And artificial technologies, intelligence technologies are becoming so integral to businesses and public markets alike. Of course, enabling huge amount of innovations and efficiency and creating avenues for economic growth. The emphasis in public discourse has been on the technological advances enabled by AI, not taking anything away from that, and the risks and benefits associated with them. As competition economists, we felt that it is equally important to discuss that what are the market implications on access to markets, etc., of firm behavior which are active in the generative AI space. So Professor Coyle's talk will then delve therefore into competition policy choices in generative AI, exploring how this transformative technology is reshaping traditional market boundaries. And it will be interesting to know if the disruptive technology, whether it will dislodge the incumbents or the business models and the emerging industrial organization will replicate the digital ecosystems of the digital platforms and Web 2.0 genre. My task is made a bit easy by because I am joined by people who are academically very, very much have deeply dived into it in India. And I envisage this to be a rich discussion. We are joined by Dr. Avik Sarkar. Thank you so much, who is a distinguished data scientist and policy expert specializing in artificial intelligence and data governance. He was an officer on special duty at Niti Aayog, the government think tank, which is a premier think tank for the government, where he was instrumental in developing India's AI strategy. Nitin Pai is with us. He's the co-founder and director of Takshashila Institution, an independent center for research on, and education in public policy, and is based out of Bangalore. We have Dr. V. Sridhar. He's a professor at the Center for Information Technology and Public Policy at the International Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore, IIITB. Dr. Sridhar has served on various Government of India committees on telecom and IT, and has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals. We have Shashank Reddy, a young person who is really doing good work in this field as a managing partner at EVAM Law and Policy, specializing in emerging technology policies. I am Payal Malik, moderator of the session, a visiting professor to the ICRIER Prosus Centre, and was formerly the advisor and head of economics at the Competition Commission of India for almost a decade between 2012 to 2023. So how we have organized this, I guess there are many participants who have joined online, but we would request Professor Diane Coyle to make her presentation, and then we can have a conversation around the issues she is going to raise in her presentation. Would you like us to share your slides, ma'am, or would you be doing that?
Let me see if I can do it here.
Yeah.
That will make it easier. And
yes.
If you're seeing the slideshow, could you let me know?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real honor to join this conversation. I'm looking forward to learning a lot from you. I guess I have two disclaimers. One is that I'm an advisor to the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK and a member of the UK government's Industrial Strategy Advisory Council, but I'm obviously speaking for myself and not for any institution. And the other is that I know very little about the Indian context, so I'm very much looking forward to that conversation. But it means that my remarks are very much focused on the UK and to some extent the EU. And let me start by saying that the issues around generative AI and competition are layered on top of issues that we already knew we had about digital markets. These are the covers of 3 reports from the UK, the US, and the EU published in 2019. I was a member of the Furman panel, the UK panel. So that's now a good 6 years ago. And the economic reasons for digital markets becoming very concentrated, tipping typically to a large incumbent, are now quite well known. It's the combination of the network effects, whereby the platform becomes more valuable to users the more users there are on the other side, the very large economies of scale and low marginal costs associated with that, and what's being called the data loop, whereby if you are an incumbent and you have a lot of users, you can collect the data from them, you can make money on advertising and improve your products and thereby gain more users. So there's this feedback loop that embeds the dominant player once the market is tipped. And the platforms then have developed large ecosystems that make switching much more costly for either suppliers or users on any side of the markets in which they're operating. So this is quite well known, and it's led to some responses, legislative in the case of the EU and UK. We have a new Digital Markets and Competition Act. The EU has its Digital Markets Act. And in terms of enforcement in the United States under the Biden administration's officials. So that's the background. And then along comes generative AI, launching to an incredible impact with ChatGPT. And so the conversation about the applications of AI in policy have really increased since then. Now, there are not very good figures on how much AI is being used, but here are some UK ones, and it suggests that usage is has already progressed quite a lot. So these are from the UK the CMA's recent technical paper on foundation models. So consumer use, 31%, rising to 79% among young people. Any of us who've got students will know that there's quite extensive use of AI by students, and we're still grappling with how to cope with that. Often that's just for fun, but increasingly for information or advice. And then business use, much lower, but about half of large businesses say they're using one form of AI and using it to improve their business operations, so hoping that it's going to be one of those process improvements that can increase productivity. These are figures from last year. It's likely gone up since then. There are also extensive margin figures, so we don't know how intensively AI tools are being used or what they're being used for, so there's a bit of a data gap, but it looks like it's going to become quite widespread. So why is there a competition issue? And there are several reasons why we would care about how AI is being used and whether the market dynamics are competitive and healthy. And the first is that it's likely to drive productivity growth. It is an amazing technology. And if we look back to the last wave of digital in the late 90s and early 2000s, this is before the mobile revolution, the technology did drive incredible productivity growth, and mainly through logistics, creating global supply chains. So it was there too, a process innovation, always the source of major productivity gains. Now, at the moment, there's a productivity puzzle among the developed economies, and research by the OECD and others suggests that it's only the frontier, the top 5 or 10% of firms in terms of productivity levels who've been able to use digital technologies to improve their productivity. That means that they're pulling further and further ahead of the majority of firms in the OECD economies. So there's a puzzle there about why is it that even before we get to generative AI, it's proving hard for companies to use the technology to improve their productivity. So there's a puzzle, but it's likely to be very important for productivity and consequently economic growth and living standards. The second issue is obviously just the scale. To train the foundation models, it takes tens of billions of dollars. It's taken many years already. All of the big companies are spending tens of billions in additional R&D this year. And on top of that, they're paying for chips, the kind of chips that are needed for the generative models, and paying the large water and electricity bills that are associated with operating them. So it's something that favors, even more than previous digital technologies, the very largest companies who've got a lot of funding. There's the issue I just raised about markets, digital markets already being quite concentrated, and needing to understand to what extent that is causing consumer harms and how we think about trading off the harms against the benefits, because consumers do love these products and on the whole don't pay directly for them. And then finally, and this is probably a growing issue, the role of both geopolitical issues and national industrial policies. Since the pandemic, at least, we've become increasingly aware about bottlenecks in supply chains, and the role of TSMC in producing advanced chips, for instance, already identified the key role of NVIDIA in producing, designing the kind of chips that are needed for generative AI. So those among other sorts of bottlenecks. And countries who look at the scale of the foundation models in the US and China and figure that their best option is to seek some areas of comparative advantage, because the likelihood that any other individual nation can match those frontier models is limited. And so today in the UK, we're getting the publication of the government's UK Action Plan, which will set out how it plans to ensure that there is some national economic advantage in adopting and using AI. Now, this means that there are some potentially quite major political challenges, and I'll just flag up Mark Zuckerberg's recent comments in a podcast, a Trump-supporting podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience, where he is clearly playing to the idea that we're not in a world of cooperation, we're in a world of competing for strategic advantage in AI. And he particularly picked on the EU. The fines that Meta and other large tech companies have been levied, often through the competition process. So that recent getting on for €1 billion fine for breaching antitrust rules. So he's complaining about this, comparing it to a tariff on American tech companies, linking it very directly to national industrial strategies. But of course, if it's a competition fine, that means that reflects an assessment of what market dominance has been costing EU consumers. But anyway, this is only likely to get more challenging territory in political terms and geopolitical terms, as well as in the kind of conventional ways we think about competition policy within the boundaries of any jurisdiction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we might be concerned about competition challenges in foundation models. And I'm going to draw on two things. One is a paper I co-authored recently with Hyana Darman at the University of Toronto, and the other is the CMA's recent technical paper on foundation models, which I think is an excellent overview to the issues. And so let's start with the value chain, because the competition dynamics are likely to be different at different layers of the technical stack. So this is the CMA's diagram. And so going down, we've got the different vertical layers, the infrastructure layer, the development of foundation models, the release of the models, and then their deployment either in tuning within a company or organization, or in the provision of apps that users can use. And so then we've got the different components of each. And a lot of the focus has been on the infrastructure because of that vast scale. So the hardware and compute, I've already talked about. There's the question about expertise. Using generative models is still a kind of craft skill. It's not very straightforward. It's not plug and play. And the large companies have employed a lot of the expertise. You'll be well aware of the vigorous debate going on in the US at the moment about the role of engineers on H-1B visas. And then, of course, there's the data, which I want to come back to, because I would put more emphasis on this than I've seen in the discussions to date. The models speak for themselves. There are several competing models. These can be either closed or open source. And there has been a lot of debate about the role of open source, in particular, in providing some competitive constraint in the market. And then the deployment layer. The diagram also shows some feedback loops, and I just want to underline that powerful data loop that's operating here. And you can see those dotted lines on the right-hand side of the diagram. It's not the same kind of network effect as with the digital platforms that I talked about a little earlier, but I think there is a powerful data loop going on here, because the models obviously have trained on a lot of data that they've been able to access. But if they don't get new data, then there's some risk of model collapse, that the quality of the output of the models deteriorates over time. And so getting that new data and the positive feedback data loop that creates is very important, I think, to market dynamics. So I just mentioned the role of open source versus closed source proprietary models, and there has been a lot of hope that open models will provide this competitive constraint. This table from the paper with Hyana shows that actually it's not clear what open means. I do think there is scope for open to play an important role, and in fact signed a statement that Mozilla convened in December 2024, saying why open models were important. But you can see from the spectrum here and the examples that actually there are different flavors of open, and relatively few are at the right-hand side of that scale. And I think there's a question about how open does a model need to be to change the dynamics in the market. And actually there's some dissent within the open source community itself about the usage of the term and whether it's correctly used in all cases. So for example, about Llama, Meta's model Llama, there is dispute about whether that's genuinely an open model or not. there's still that worry that I mentioned a little earlier about the web of relationships among the incumbents. So this chart shows the big American tech companies in the middle, and their relationships with both the models, the large models, and developers of the large models, and other providers. And it's a really complex web, as you can see here. What's interesting about the chart is that Meta and Apple stand out for not being embedded in this web in the same way as the other big four. And indeed, they're not at the forefront of a lot of the hype about AI. But these aren't all ownership stakes. Some of them are partnerships of some kind, strategic partnerships. Some of them are investment stakes. And NVIDIA in particular has relationships with a lot of these companies, including by investing in the customers of the big companies buying its chips. And so one has to wonder about the sustainability of that kind of market relationship. So just to underline, these aren't all acquisitions. There are other types of relationship. It's either access to compute data, but also reaching down into the applications layer. And this means because it crosses the stack, that competition economists are brushing off work in the past on vertical relationships. For a long time, there was less attention paid to vertical relationships in competition economics because of the presumption that if you had sufficient competition at the end demand stage of the vertical chain, the rest of it would sort itself out. And I think that is now changing because of these kinds of relationships in generative AI. And I have now changed my mind about the location of the significant competition policy challenge here. I had thought it was going to be at the level of the development of the foundation models because of the issues of scale, compute access, and so on. Actually, I think there's turning out to be more competition there than I'd expected, although an open question about how long that's sustained because they're all losing so much money at the moment on AI. I now think it's probably going to be at the applications end where there are going to be concerns. And that's because of the scope to use AI across these already dominant ecosystems. So here is just an illustration of some of the many brands that Google owns and many of the services it provides. And each of those has got a set of end users and also a set of suppliers. So it's an extremely large, complicated, and quite entrenched ecosystem. So I now think we're more likely to see the role of AI being embedded into these pre-existing applications. And we are seeing that already. And this creates a different kind of feedback loop. Again, this is from the CMA report. And as it says here, the incumbents can shape foundation model related markets in their own interests. They have the partnerships, they control access to market, they control the technology upstream and downstream. And I think the challenge that we face as competition people is going to be preventing generative AI from being used to cement existing ecosystem advantages. There's a lot of research going on different approaches to foundation models, including small models, different kinds of chips. So I'm now less worried about upstream and more worried about downstream. So one implication of that is the need to think more about what are ecosystem theories of harm. And there's been some discussion, as I'm sure people know, in the economics community about to what extent an ecosystem theory of harm differs from the old conglomerate theories of harms that date back several decades now. And my view is that ecosystems aren't simply like conglomerates. And that's because of the way they cross both the vertical layers of the stack and horizontal effects as well. They develop around these central platforms, which are already quite embedded. And there are lots of complex interactions between the services with these different kinds of relationships, which may be owned, but they may be strategic partnerships, they may be supply chain relationships. And it means that this is hard to monitor. You can't define markets in a straightforward way. And to think about the economic incentives, there are some quite complicated strategic issues going on here. So there may be reasons why the dominant platform would trade off short-term versus long-term advantages. There are going to be significant network effects, particularly from data, and that means it's getting ever harder for consumers to switch out or switch between ecosystems. And so that means that there are weak competitive constraints and very large entry barriers. And if you think about even somebody who's developing some wonderful new different kind of foundation model, maybe a small model, facing one of these ecosystems and identifying which services offer the scope for entry, particularly when you don't have the advantages of scale and cross-subsidy and you don't have the data advantage, seems incredibly problematic. But I think these ecosystem theories of harm are not yet fully specified, and they will need to be, because we know that if there are competition enforcement actions, the companies themselves will very strongly lobby against that and could potentially bog that down for many years in the legal system. So I think that's another challenge, thinking really carefully about how to specify the theories. One of the key issues to me seems to be innovation. And we know from the existing literature that the theory on innovation and competition points in both directions. If you've got market power, you've got more profit, therefore you can afford to innovate. But on the other hand, you've got less incentive to innovate, and the empirics of this are unclear. But we're at a moment of these major technological transformations. It's not just AI and digital, it's also energy, clearly, but also all of the digital technology using sectors that are affected by these transitions. And the new kinds of issues that I mentioned right at the start of this presentation, what about standards, what about licensing, and how do we think about what are national advantages? And do we need to think carefully as individual nations about our role in these key technologies? But part of the theory of harm, it seems to me, is about the direction of innovation. The big tech companies are spending a small fortune, or a large fortune, in fact, on research and development. They're the biggest spenders in R&D in the United States. But what is it that they're developing? They are going to face the innovator's dilemma. They're not really going to spend the money on genuinely challenging innovative technologies, such as low energy or compound chips, or different approaches to generative models. So a final slide, what are we going to do about this? They're great technologies. Consumers love the services, so competition authorities have to tread very carefully before thinking about disrupting the markets. But I think it's clear that the market power that exists already is being exploited. A lot of work has been going on about monopsony power and the impact on the quality of jobs and earnings in labour markets, platform labour markets. Also, this term, which I don't like, but has become widely used, from Cory Doctorow, the American commentator, enshittification, the slow but progressive degradation of the quality of the services. I've illustrated this here with an Amazon page screen grab. I searched for Uniqlo clothing, very standard brand, and the first page is either sponsored ads or Amazon's own competing products. So there's already the market power problem. And then this innovation issue, what kind of innovation is going to go on? And how do we ensure that there is scope for continuing radical innovations rather than incremental innovations that increase the profits of the incumbents? And then the complexity that this isn't just about economics. It's not just about the economic or even the legal analysis, but it's political as well. And so the final screen grab here, Brazil has actually several times now shown that it is possible to stand up to some of the practices of the big companies, and it's now asked Meta to explain its recent announcement about stopping moderation of posts. So I'm going to stop there. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I think there are some huge issues here. Perhaps one final word is about data, which I've mentioned several times and didn't put on this slide. But I think thinking about the role for requiring more provision of data in some form by the big tech companies is one of the tools that we might think about. So let me stop sharing there, and really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Payal, you are on mute, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Coyle. So in a very short duration of 20 minutes, you have brought out almost all the issues related to this new industrial organization, which is emerging because new business models are emerging. And these new business models, as in the platform Web 2.0 digital markets, were very challenging for competition authorities to deal with. And the authorities world over are thinking of new antitrust tools. But what you have brought out is extremely important, and also is the fact that competition is not an end in itself. And with such transformative technologies, governments and industrial policies now have resurfaced, because in economies like ours in India, industrial policies were supposed to be relegated once markets took over and competition took over. But given the fact that now competition is so limited in these markets, given they are network goods, endogenously leading to concentrated markets, to therefore limit dependencies on a handful of firms, governments are now increasingly thinking of bringing industrial policy back from the back burner, if may I say so, through initiatives which would provide contestability or competition to these firms. Say, for instance, in India, the India AI mission is thinking and has started and has made relative progress on bringing independence in compute infrastructure, because when you're talking about dependencies, you talked about how these you're not now concerned about so much about the foundation models, because they are far more competitive than you thought initially was. And so did CMA started with foundation model as perhaps the bottleneck or the choke point, but to competition. But compute resources and the dependencies, because when we did our market studies and discussed a lot with the startups, it was the dependencies on the compute resources which then enabled a handful of companies to be able to, either through partnerships or through minority acquisitions, and we will get into the problems which competition authorities face in looking at these partnerships, because by and large there is no consensus whether or not the present antitrust laws, given the notifiability thresholds and given the definition of control, whether they can look at these partnerships in a standard merger or an acquisition format. These cloud compute resources, or the owners of these cloud compute resources and GPUs, etc., have been able to create these dependencies through which then therefore they may be able to, and these are early days, orchestrate a new ecosystem. And I like the graph where you showed that Meta and Apple are not a part of this entire network of partnerships. And as the operating systems and the search engines, so operating systems of the past, created these dependencies and made sure that these entities get larger because of these dependencies. Cloud compute happens to be, and processing GPUs, etc., happen to be the choke point where these dependencies can be created and ecosystems can be enlarged. But so this was just to start the debate. I think I would just open the discussion, and if I could request Dr. Avik Sarkar to give his views on how do you think the Indian ecosystem is developing, given the fact that what we understood, the startups by and large felt that there are quite a bit of synergies in getting resources which they cannot create themselves. And so therefore they are in so-called complementary firms, but taking upon or through partnerships, drawing upon the resources of the incumbent big tech firms. And if you could, because you have done your work on data governance also, and Professor Coyle talked about these data feedback loops, how do you see the Indian ecosystem developing, and do you see some parallels here and the concerns, some of the concerns which have been raised?
Yes, thanks, Professor Payal. Can you hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Yes, great. I just wanted to check that before. So I think this is a very nice discussion and very timely one. While we are still grappling with all the regulations that is going on around us related to AI and more in terms of from generative AI. So I think a lot of very interesting points that Professor Doyle you raised on what are the competition issues per se in terms of data, the funding to train the AI model, the market structures, which include the chips and stuff, and then the geopolitics angle also. I think these are all very relevant aspects that we come into it. The challenge when we come to India becomes even more multifold. And why multifold is when we talk about data particularly, and Professor Payal also mentioned about data. Data in India, when we're looking at, say, beyond Indian languages, is not in digitized format. So when you look into building these models, what you're looking at is that the data is there in digital format with someone. Either you have to scrape it off the web, or it is beyond some barrier or some firewall. You need to get access to it. Maybe say YouTube videos or Facebook comments. So it's already in digital format. And then how do you use it? What are the norms and laws for using it? And then available compute. So for us, it becomes even bigger challenge because we didn't have that fourth industrial revolution where a lot of these data points have been digitized. So what data that we see digitized in India is only the top English and the Hindi content over there. And even a lot of the regional content that we're looking at in India is not in digital format at all. So I think we have to step back and see how government can first promote startups, promote people in the ecosystem to work on some of these things, and then build an ecosystem around it. Coming more into the data problem itself again, I see that some of these languages are so small, so maybe only a few million people are speaking in those languages. The big techs might not be interested in them. So it's a reverse problem in India. They are trying to build them because you see the big ones, everyone, be it Facebook, Google, Microsoft, they're all spending a large amount of research dollars in India to tap the Indian market, particularly the Indian languages market, because they understand there is a huge market here and that needs to be tapped. And to tap that, they have to first understand Indian languages. Just by converting something from English to, say, a Bengali or to a Marathi or Gujarati will not work. So I think that's the big challenge. Get those native information which is there and not already digitized, bringing onto them. So I think that brings in that big other challenge to the Indian market. The other aspect that you talked about, I think funding of AI models and which are the companies doing it. I think in India, we have only a very few companies who are trying to build their indigenous model in India. We have Sarvam, Krutrim, and OpenHati, the three companies which are at a good level, who are building their AI models in the Gen AI aspects. I think geopolitics angle, I think it becomes more relevant when you're looking at a big tech when you go on to say LLM and ask a question, then which opinion or which point of view are they presenting? I think that is where the thing that you are looking at. Say if you ask a question on, say, the Russia and Ukraine war, depending on which citizen you are, it might give you a narrative of that nature. So then there the geopolitics plays a role. Is the narrative that has been told there aligned to your country or not, or is something that your country's citizens might not like? I think those things are there, but I think we are, I think, safe from that perspective. There are aspects that has to be taken into element, but I think India's problems are a bit different from the European problems because I think a lot of your talk focused on the challenges that Europe is facing from the big tech, but I think India's problems are very I think very, very, very different from there. And we have to promote our own startups because big techs will not do a lot for the Indian languages. We are not in war actively with anyone, so or any in our region. So I think we are fine with the geopolitics part. I think we try to maintain a friendly relationship with everyone. We are also promoting a lot on the DPI, the digital public infrastructure, because I think what you listed in your talk and also what we will discuss is that these are the problems, and we are looking at regulations as one of the way to look into this problem. Like you saw the examples from say Brazil or what European Union is doing, putting fines. But until and unless but if there is no other player in the market, a few million dollars of fine, I think is a very, very big amount in terms of the billions of dollars in market capitalization that they have. You find them, but there is no other alternative. Next year, they will only use it. So I think it's high time that we start thinking of building alternatives. And alternatives where, say, government also plays an important role. And that is why I think India is promoting a lot of the digital public infrastructure along in lines of citizen identity, like what we have for Aadhaar, for AI, for digital payments, and a lot of these. And this is something that was also discussed in the G20 declaration last year and also the year before that. I think this is the line that we have to take. I think I believe regulations cannot combat this menace because things will evolve and it's very difficult to combat that part. I'll stop for now. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you so much, Avik. So before I ask Professor Sridhar, so Professor Coyle, this is one thing which in India, because our startup ecosystem is very thriving in the application layer, because we looked at the entire AI stack. And when it comes to providing decentralized solutions to decentralized problems, the AI startups, the startups in the AI technology stack are doing their role. But as I said, they are still dependent for, say, cloud computing, for cloud infrastructure on these large companies. And what needs to be seen, and I'm perfectly in agreement with what Dr. Avik Sarkar is saying, that India is adopting what is known as a techno-legal or a third way, that is not just pure technical regulation, and as you also have mentioned, the digital public infrastructure way, so that the dependencies of the startups, because that's where once the dependencies start, if you're dependent only on a handful of companies for a very important input into your applications, then it is possible for them to orchestrate the entire ecosystem. So discussions around computing power, discussion around open data sets. So Indian AI mission is talking about creating Indic language, and we have Bhashini there as an Indic language open data set with which are with open non-discriminatory access. So alternate solutions, alternate to regulations may have to emerge. Even in the context of EU, we have also heard the limitations of competition policy and limitations of regulation in actually delivering, and therefore Euro stack needs to be delivered so that EU has its own capabilities to be able to take on these handful of companies. So my question now, so this is one of my major comment, but my question on what makes me a little talking about dependencies is the role of these open source models. Yes, of course, the definition of these open source models is also out. The jury is still out. What is open? Because training data sets are not shared, model weights are not shared. So most of these startups in using these open source models are basically either using directly through APIs or downloading and creating their own applications. How does the data feedback loop take place in that context, in the sense if they are working on the platform using the APIs of these large open source models, is this feeding back? Is this real-time data feeding back into these large language models and making them or refining them? Or using these open source models, using some data sets which are more application specific, one can therefore think of a niche market of these small language models where the Indian startups are gaining some traction, but open source models is something which they need to depend upon. And how will that dependency shape? And will the small language models be able to replace or will be able to at least democratize the market?
Yes, that's for me.
I was asking Professor Coyle, and then I could ask Sridhar about the startup ecosystem in India. Yeah.
So I'll be brief because I want to hear from others also. So as far as I understand it, it's very hard to stop data feeding back into a model if you're using a model. And so one of the reasons for hesitation among consultancies or law firms about using generative models is exactly how do you stop that data leakage? But I think, as you're hinting, there is definitely scope for some comparative advantage if there are sets of data that the large models just haven't accessed. And more generally, I like Dr. Sarkar's emphasis on the role of government in providing alternatives. It's not been part of the conversation much in Europe and the UK, but I think it's something we definitely need to think about, including national data infrastructure and how do you make open source data widely accessible to improve the market dynamics.
And just one quick question also on these open source models. You have written a lot about them. So you just mentioned how open are these open source models and what is the downside and what is, again, are we just promoting some few companies or these open source models because they are not doing anything free? There's no free lunch. So what's going on?
Well, they're definitely welcome because they're all more open than the proprietary models. And actually, I think sometimes for many users, an open source model that doesn't reveal all of the training data, for example, but has very clean license conditions, that's actually an advantage. That forms a platform on which the application layer can become competitive. But as I said, there's still debate in the community itself about how exactly do you define open, and it's a little bit theological sometimes.
Right. So Professor Sridhar, how are you seeing, sitting in Bangalore, how are these startups shaping up? Of course, they are doing a tremendous job of providing solutions, AI-based solutions, not only just to enterprises, but to agriculture, education, etc. So how do you see this relationship and building up while sitting between the big tech and the incumbent tech firms and startups?
So, Payal, I would like to take on two issues. I'll come back to your question second. The first one is I'd like to continue on the debate on open systems, which has been described by Dr. Coyle as well. I just want to share this particular slide. Are you able to see that? See, as Dr. Coyle mentioned, there's not just one or two foundational models. These are all foundational models, about 15 of them. This is the report which has been published by the Center for Research on Foundational Models at Stanford. And if you look at that from the transparency point of view, that is how the data on models that these foundational models are using are open for use, open for explainability, and you open for source identifiability and so on. If you see, even Llama 2, which says that it is an open source model, comes very much behind some of the foundational models, such as, for example, Star Code or Granite of IBM and so on. So there are a lot of, about 15 of the foundational models exist, right? And some of these are small, some of these are very niche. For example, Star Coder, the whole objective of this foundational model is to help programming. Whereas the stable diffusion, video diffusion model by Stability AI is more focused on video content, right? The generative models for video and so on and so on, right? So we seem to have not just one or two companies which dictate or provide foundational models, but a large number of them as well. So given that some of the foundational models are small and they might be getting the data from the other large models, so I think one of the things that we need to look at is how do we separate this infrastructure layer, which is provided by the foundational models, from the rest of the applications. Is it possible that we can go back to the old telecom model where you have an infrastructure, you provide equal access by regulation,
Yeah.
Maybe for fees, may not be for fees, but that stands as the bottom. And then the other things can be built on top of it. So one way is to separate it out, in terms of accounting separation, business, legal separation, in terms of infrastructure separation. Can we separate these foundational models from the rest of the ecosystem? The second aspect is, once the foundational models are there, then we can always build specific vertical models on top of it. For example, I think Dr. Sarkar mentioned about Sarvam AI. Sarvam AI is building a lot of models, right? One of these is the Indic language model, which uses Llama 2, right? So which uses the basic foundational models to build on top of it a specific language model. There is something called as A1 legal, which helps lawyers decode, for example, the acts and laws which are present and also the cases. So that model is built on top of the foundational model. So there's going to be, I'm saying that there are going to be a lot of these small models which are customized for certain applications, but depend on the foundational models. So if we separate out the infrastructure from the above, then if we by regulation ask them to provide equal access, then this problem could be possibly solved. So, for example, Dr. Sarkar mentioned about the problem with, having a lot of data in Indic languages on the web to build a very verifiable, very robust language models for India. So there is a lot of research which is going on using what we call as few shots learning. So which means that using very small number of instances, small amount of data, is it possible to still have good amount of predictability and do some forecasting and things like that. So those techniques are coming up. In fact, even at IIIT Bangalore, we are working on some of these Indic language models, which do not depend on large data, but can work on small data sets, right? So these are all new types of algorithms and models which can be built and to provide this competitive landscape, especially on top of the foundation model. That's briefly my view, Payal. We can come back and answer some of these questions later on.
Yeah, so because our report also talks about the emergence of these small language models, working on the foundational models and creating very specific solutions to specific Indic problems, so which could therefore then perhaps allow for democratization of the technology, and our startups are doing a fantastic job in that. Nitin, I come to you now because let's see what is your perspective. How do you look at the AI markets developing in India? Yeah.
Thanks, Payal. Yeah, I was listening with great interest to the conversations. A lot of it is something which I would just nod my head and say, this is the way to go, right? Because so few AI governance conversations are about competition policy that it's not even funny, right? A lot of AI governance conversations go into very esoteric issues. They are important, but the core of all of this is competition policy. So I'm glad that we've focused on that. I want to talk about something deeply which concerns people like us who are interested in competition policy. If you were working in competition policy 100 years ago, and you were asked, what is it that you do? What is it that you're looking for? You would say one of two things. One is you would say, look, we don't want big companies to form monopolies, right? So we want to be able to check on monopolistic power. We don't want them to gang up together and play with prices. So the second thing you would do is you'd look at consumer prices and say, hey, look, is there any hanky-panky going on here? Is there collusion, etc.? And then you would use these two sort of poles to sort of navigate your competition policy work, right? So you'd work on, you'd look for people making supernormal profits. You would look for, profit margins. You would look at margins at the retail level and so on. So none of this actually required regulators to think, or competition policy people to look more deeply and ask a more fundamental question: why, right? Why exactly are you worried about market power? Why exactly are you worried about consumer protection is easy, right? I mean, you say, look, you don't want people in the marketplace to be fleeced. So consumer protection is easy. There's some amount of fairness, justice, etc. involved in that. But why market power? Like, why are you worried about one big company dominating the market, right? This question has become all the more important for us in the information age, because we've got to ask this question, because the consumer question is very easy now, right? Google price to consumer is usually zero. Many of the services, even AI models, most of the time the price is zero. You might have a premium service which is more expensive, but most people can use the normal service at paying a sort of a zero price. So why is it that we are interested in this? And I think there are two answers. The first is we are really protecting the cognitive autonomy of a citizen, right? What you don't want is some kind of an epistemic closure where all the sources of knowledge and information available to a citizen are monopolized or dominated by one player, one ideology, one player, one point of view, one right way of doing things. And that so captures the mind that the individual is not able to make rational decisions, right? Because it's completely closed. And all sorts of information, and we also know enough from cognitive neuroscience how people make decisions, right? The people don't make rational decisions in terms of weighing pros and cons. They go by social proof. There are information cascades and so on, which manifest in the form of the citizen or the person not being able to make a decision based on rational thinking, right? Or reason. So you do need to have competition in the information space to ensure that, for the want of a better phrase, to ensure that consumers or users have choice of thought processes, a choice of systems, choice of epistemologies to be able to do. It's deeper. And it connects to the second point as to why is it that we ought to be concerned about, even 100 years ago, railroad monopolies or telecom monopolies. What's so bad about one person or one company acquiring so much market power? Well, the answer is market power translates into political power, and you don't want one entity or one group of people to have that much of political power that it can hijack public policy, right? So, and today I don't think we need to be able to sort of even explain this to people. Elon Musk standing on the side of Donald Trump tells you everything that there is to know, because political power seems to be beholden to economic power, right? And beholden to somebody who's now at the apex of the pyramid in terms of all information industries, and therefore has political power. Therefore, I think when we look at the big why question of competition policy with respect to artificial intelligence, we've got to zero in on these two things, right? Do people have cognitive autonomy? This becomes the price, watching the price in the old days. You're not looking at price to consumer, but you're looking at the choice that the consumer has in terms of epistemology. And the second is you're looking at concentration of market power that leads to directly and indirectly to a political power, right? And it becomes, almost like there's a particular phrase for this which I miss, but it's like bolting the door after the horse is fled. You just get one chance, because if you don't act early enough and constrain market power of these guys, they capture policy, right? And then you have to wait for the next big technological change to come in order to have the opportunity to break that power. So the urgency, therefore, is it's not just a Europe issue, it's not just an India issue, it's not even a US, it's a global issue. And the real question is, how do you act fast enough to ensure that policy is not captured by people who have market power in the information economy, especially in artificial intelligence?
Yeah, thank you, Nitin. That was really, really very insightful, because you gave the meta framework for why competition, because otherwise competition law, competition regulation, competition policy is seen something very esoteric debate, which is left for competition economists, competition lawyers, etc. But given the large economy-wide ramifications, how competition policy, and that is the discussion in Europe also, is one element of the larger economic policy, because if you want, and the political outcomes also now are very, very clear. So it's one of the major elements of a larger economic policy where you would bring in choice, because choice was never a word in competition economics, and that's why economists are being now ridiculed, because economists only went for efficiency. Choice was never an aspect of competition in the standard competition frameworks of economics. But choice becomes important because choice has then economy-wide ramifications, general equilibrium ramifications, and that's what we saw in platforms. So in a partial market, say for a search engine or some other markets, so to speak, there may be huge amounts of demand-side efficiencies, but the dependencies which it's creating, and large economy or large actors of the economy are dependent on these technologies, and what kind of relationships it creates with the complementers. Therefore, competition policy becomes also important, and choice is an extremely important and a new kid on the block when it comes to competition policy. And thanks for bringing that out. So I'll just now want Shashank, given your experience, what do you think about AI, markets, and competition from the Indian context, global context, and please share your experiences. Yeah.
You're muted, Shashank.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, sorry. Thanks a lot, Professor Malik. So I work mostly with startups in my space, right? So my understanding of this entire area also stems a lot from how they view the question of AI and competition. And I think from my perspective, it fundamentally comes down to 2 points at this point of time, right? I am generally, just personally speaking, so if there are two sides to this question of whether we should be worried about the competition issues that AI throws up at this point of time, fundamentally, I would say yes, but practically, I'm on the side that says that, it might be a little too early to take a call on this. So there are a lot of news headlines across the world. There's a lot of fear, and I think rightly so, that the dominance of the big tech firms might translate into the dominance of an AI-led economy. But I feel that might not necessarily be the case, right? Because an AI-first economy is going to be a very different beast, and and would have a very different implications from the internet and the digital age that we have seen so far, right? So for example, I think the best example of this is Google, right? Google's dominance in the internet age, underpinned by its search engine, is unquestioned, right? And is unparalleled almost. In many ways, Google search has crafted the internet experience as we know it, right? Through the use of SEOs, through the creation, like it has allowed independent websites to come up through Google Ads, and Google AdWords has underpinned the internet economy for almost the last 20-25 years, right? But Google's dominance in search does not necessarily mean it's going to dominate the AI economy. In fact, if you look at how well Gemini is doing, or how popular Gemini is doing, Gemini is nowhere as popular as OpenAI, or like even Perplexity, or even Perplexity.ai, right? Or Microsoft's Copilot. And in fact, the rise of platforms like Chat GPT undermines the very economic model that Google runs on. So a company like Google
that has been so dominant for 20 years is in fact in the midst of an existential crisis right now. It has to completely reinvent itself to survive the next 30 years or so. I mean, no, not even the next 30 years, the next 20 years or so, or it's going to collapse. It's not so its dominance cannot be taken for granted at all. And I think this is a fundamental sort of aspect of what artificial intelligence and AI-led economy can do. In fact, if we are to talk about competition issues in this, the one company, in my opinion, that we should be a little worried about is Meta, because Meta's Llama model is the largest quote unquote open source model in the world. But as has been pointed out before, there is no consensus on what an open model is, and we don't know exactly how open Meta's models are. The second aspect of it is from the startups perspective, from the smaller companies perspective, their access to these foundational models, to the large language models, has enabled them to offer a host of new services, has enabled them to build a host of new applications. And as you would have, as you pointed out, Professor Malik, most of them do not really view big tech as a sort of dangerous foe in this space, right? They see it as a form of symbiotic relationship, because they need access to those models to improve their own offerings, to improve their own productivity, and they in turn benefit right from access to those models. And you don't have like a number of Indian companies and all that offer such foundational models, and that might change with as Sarvam and all continue growing. But in that sense, then the question is a more philosophical question. How do we fundamentally view artificial intelligence and the compute capacities and the foundational models? And Professor Sridhar touched upon this when he spoke about it as infrastructure, right? So if it is to be seen as fundamental infrastructure, as an infrastructure layer, then it can be regulated as an infrastructure layer. Then in that sense, the questions of competition are also the same questions that come up when you're talking about, say, utilities. Now, at the end of the day, you don't, because the other side of the competition question is, if you have 1,000 different models all right out there, or like 10,000 different models out there, how are you going to ensure that each and every one of them meets the same standards of, say, data security, privacy, right, ethics, etc. Right? In this regard, it might actually be far better to deal with a few companies, and by a few companies, I mean they could be some 24 companies, 3 dozen companies, how much ever, but a manageable set of companies that run the foundational layer, right? Who you can hold to a really specific standard of ethics and regulation. So
yeah,
I think,
so what you have raised, so you have raised some openings, at least what you're pointing out is by and large that it is disruptive. It may dislodge incumbents, but if it is dislodging incumbent for other incumbents, that is another discussion which happens in the antitrust ecosystem. Is it being replaced by new entrants, or is it is amongst the few GAFAM companies that the power equations are changing? So that's one issue. And for talking, I think we just need to briefly touch about these partnerships also, because these partnerships are, while they are providing these scarce resources to startups to develop, but are these partnerships that benign? At least in the Indian case, what we found was they are by and large not control conferring partnerships, and they are kind of accelerator programs helping these startups. So I would just request my team member, I think Bhargavi had some question on it, so I'll just open it up for Professor Coyle, if it's okay for five more minutes for 2 or 3 questions. Yeah. So Bhargavi, would you want to ask? Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor Coyle. I had a question on partnerships. So my question is that what do you foresee to be the main potential concerns when it comes to non-exclusive compute and distribution partnerships between the AI cloud providers and AI startups? Because this is the main type of partnerships that we are seeing being like emerging in the Indian context and even globally. Like, for example, the AWS and Anthropic partnership, which is non-exclusive, but one of the provisions of that partnership was, for example, privileged or early access to the models. So do you see those kind of provisions or, as problematic or, that's my question. Thank you.
Great question, thank you. I mean, to the extent it's non-exclusive, it's obviously much less worrying than exclusive partnerships. I think the broader issue is about the complexity it introduces into understanding the market dynamics and thinking about what are the incentives and how do you monitor what's happening across the whole ecosystem. But clearly, as the discussion has highlighted, there are some advantages in partnerships and the role that the foundation models play in enabling innovation and competition at the startup layer.
Yeah, Shiva, I think you're raising your hand. Do you have a question?
Yes, I had a very quick question, a bit left of center from our current conversation, for Professor Diane. Professor, I want to get basically your opinion on what you think about the intersection between Gen AI and copyright law, especially through the lens of competition, particularly in light of the current revelations that Meta knowingly torrented and used copyrighted content to train their own, which is now what they're calling an open model. And especially because I think the UK has also thought about having a consultation on this topic recently.
Yeah, well, as you're aware, it's a very fraught topic, and it seems like existing intellectual protection law in many countries doesn't really account for the kinds of uses of copyrighted material at the moment. As things stand, as the law stands, the foundation models have broken the law in terms of using copyrighted material. Are they going to be penalized for that in some way? It doesn't look like it. So I think it's actually an open question about how do you ensure that if the models suck up all the copyrighted material, there's no redress against that immediately, then what are the legal arrangements needed to make sure that the creators whose ideas have been used benefit from that? And at the moment, that's not happening. I think this will turn out to be one of the real hot potatoes in policy for generative AI. It's a great question.
Yeah, and just continuing from that, and just to end the conversation, if I would request Professor Sridhar and Dr. Sarkar and Professor Coyle, if at the least, what do you think the data governance laws, are they sufficient? So India has and will be soon implementing a digital personal data protection law. The proposals and the kind of clauses in that law are similar to many other data protection laws like data minimization, purpose limitation, consent, etc. Will they be sufficient for dealing with data governance in the AI space, or new laws need to be created when it comes to data governance for AI-related issues? So Professor Coyle, if you could go first, and then I would request Avik.
I think there are others in the conversation who know much more than I do about it, but my short answer would be no, we don't have the governance arrangements in place yet. And in fact, thinking about the collective aspects of data and what ought to be open and shared and what are the right structures just seem an increasingly important question. But I think other panelists know more than I do about this, so I'll defer to them.
Yeah, Dr. Sarkar, your views?
Yes, so I think there are two aspects that I will talk to you about. One is particularly we are try to talk about regulations at this point. But if you are looking into data to start with, if any data is generated, what are the rights of the different parties who are generating the data, the co-ownership? So if you are if you're posting on a social media platform, what right you have on the data, what right the platform has on the data, what right the internet service provider has on the data. Then if you take, say, you are riding and taking an Uber car, and the car is a BMW and you are a user. So Uber has access to the data, BMW has access to the machine data, you as an individual have access to the data. So we have to first define these boundaries about who has the rights to the data. And only then we can go to the next step of coming up with the regulation. So I am part of the GPAI, where many of you know. So we came up with the report on co-ownership of ownership rights of co-generated data. That's one. So this is what we have to figure out things as we go along, and then these laws will evolve. The other thing which I feel, because I have come from a technology background and now I'm into regulations, is that we are in very early stages of generative AI, and the technology will develop to a large extent. We are trying to regulate the technology even before the technology has plateaued. So if you look into in the early 1900s, when cars were and automobiles were still new, in UK they came up with a norm, and Professor Doyle, nothing to do with you. It's just a 100-year-old example. A car going can have maximum, I think, 5 miles per hour speed, but someone in front of the car has to run and clear the road. Now you can think 100 years later, this was not something which was that was required. But the technology has not developed to a level. Seat belts were not there, airbags were not there. So we have to wait for the seat belts and the airbags in this technology to develop. And once the technology plateaus, then maybe we can look into regulations in a much more better manner.
So there are so many issues. We have just been in an hour and 15, 20 minutes been able to cover, but at least it was a fascinating way to start these conversations in India. And I thought Professor Coyle's presentation, because it has covered the entire landscape of competition issues and given us a lot of food for thought to go about thinking in terms of what's good for India. I had one chat message, which of course is from Manas Chaudhary. Manas, I just want to generally, I know there won't be a general answer to this, because what he's talking about the judiciary and its lack of capacity to understand these technologies and therefore be able to provide holistic and remedies to the problem. And so therefore these are starting days, and that is why the role of academicians, think tanks, etc., becomes important, that these complex technologies are understood, the development of these markets are understood. And as for instance, when it came to the multi-sided markets, it was the economists who developed frameworks to assess these markets with a seminal paper by Jean Tirole. And so therefore contributions from economists like Professor Coyle and many others is extremely important to simplify these issues, to make. So now we hear these words, network effects, multi-sided markets, cross-site externalities in courtrooms, because these words have been made very, very amenable and accessible to, and made the judiciary understand that. So it is the role of lawyers, economists, and technocrats to do that. So just because it is complex, we should not give up. And so with this, I think I will just close the session today with thanks from ICRIER Prosus Centre to the participants, especially to our speaker, Professor Coyle. Thanks to Avik, thanks to Nitin, Shashank, and Professor Sridhar. Thank you very, very much, and we will stay in touch. Thanks.
Thank you.